Her family says she begged for protection, but in the end, her legal cry for help allegedly was not enough. She did everything she was supposed to do, filed a protection order, went to the police, and told the courts she was afraid. But just one day after her ex-fiancé bonded out of jail, 36-year-old Jamie Hagen was killed. I'll break down what happened and why Jamie's family says the system failed her. For Law and Crime News, I'm Kennedi Walker. The same man Jamie Hagen feared would kill her reportedly broke into her home and did just that. Jamie was a daughter, friend, and mother to a little girl. Now they have to live the rest of their lives without her because of the alleged actions of this man, her ex-fiancé, 54-year-old Casey Kindt. Kindt and Jamie got engaged after dating for 2 years, according to Jamie's family. But their relationship ended when Jamie's dad says Kindt started to get aggressive. In fact, things got so bad that according to court documents obtained by WDBJ, Jamie had filed a protection order against her ex. Those documents say Kindt allegedly assaulted Jamie and threatened her and her daughter in December. After Kindt was arrested and charged with making terroristic threats, third-degree domestic assault resulting in injuries, and child abuse without injury. At this point, you may be thinking the worst is over. Jamie did everything she was supposed to do to try to protect herself and her daughter. She called the police, she filed a restraining order, and her ex was arrested and charged. By all accounts, she should have been safe. That's what everyone says you're supposed to do when you are in danger. But that is not what unraveled. According to an arrest affidavit, Kindt was released on bond after the alleged assault. Then, despite the protection order, he violated his bond by contacting Jamie. So he was arrested again, and at this point, it seems like the legal system is working. He broke the rules and was taken back into custody. But then something happened that Jamie's family says should have never been allowed. Prosecutors tried to keep Kindt behind bars. They asked the judge to revoke his bond entirely, but instead, the judge raised it to $75,000. Kindt paid it and walked free. And less than 24 hours later, Jamie Hagen was dead. Nebraska State Patrol said Kindt showed up at her home and shot her multiple times before turning that gun on himself. He did survive the shooting and was rushed to the hospital. Jamie's father told WDBJ the system failed his daughter and that she did everything she was supposed to do, and Kindt should have never been given bond and allowed free. Domestic violence victims across the country continue to be murdered by their abusers. According to a report by the United Nations, more than 500,000 women were killed worldwide by an intimate partner or family member in 2017. And here to discuss this story with me is Joe Tamburino, an attorney and legal commentator in Minneapolis. Joe, this is such a sad story.
It's extremely sad, and thank you for having me on, Kennedy. It's just extremely sad, it's tragic, and I think it could have been prevented.
Absolutely. Well, let's just dive right in. Jamie's family is saying that they believe the system failed her. What do you think?
Yes, it did. It failed her in one horrific way, and that's by not keeping Mr. Kindt away from her, even though she did everything she could to keep him away from her. And in the end, that wasn't enough what the system did.
Yeah, and just going more into that, Jamie reportedly made complaints about the suspect before his arrest. What more could have been done to legally protect her?
A number of things could have been done extra than what actually happened. I mean, let's take it from Ms. Hagen's point of view. She did everything she could. She cooperated with the police. She called the police. She got restraining orders. She cooperated with the prosecution. This was not her fault. And the police did what they could. They arrested him. They put him in jail. The prosecutor, they did what they could. They asked for high bail. They asked to revoke his previous bail. But in the end, the judge decided to put the bail only at $75,000, which is the judge's prerogative, but it had obviously fatal consequences. Now, what else could have been done? Well, a few things. Number one, when he being Mr. Kindt, kept repeatedly violating his conditions and kept trying to contact Ms. Hagen, they could have arrested him and revoked his bail and set a very high bail, something like, say, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Number two, they could have done what's called a GPS monitoring system. That happens in all court systems throughout the country, where you put a monitor on a person's ankle say, that has a geographic restriction. So if the person went to a certain area, it would alert someone. Absolutely, it would have alerted someone. And lastly, they could have had some type of check system, meaning that every day he would have to call into pretrial services, something along those lines, to make sure that he was abiding by his conditions of release.
And from a legal perspective, just how exactly was this whole, process possible? I mean, as we just spoke about, Mr. Kindt, he was arrested multiple times for allegedly violating those bond conditions, yet he was repeatedly released. So from your perspective, just how does this keep happening? And shouldn't those violations specifically, be enough to deny bail?
Well, it depends on the state. In Nebraska, as with almost all states, you have a right to bail, and you have a right to reasonable bail. It shouldn't be excessive. And what is excessive? Well, say you have a DWI and the bail is set at $100,000. It's your first time DWI, no one was hurt in the situation. That's excessive. However, even with a right to bail, there are some limitations. And what are those? Well, if you keep violating the conditions of release, a judge can revoke your previous bail, which means the system keeps the money, and set a higher bail and set other conditions, like I mentioned before about the GPS monitoring. Now, judges are not clairvoyant. They can't tell the future. They make calls, balls and strike calls every day in court. However, when you have someone who is repeatedly violating court orders, of course you should pay particular attention to them and make sure that they're not going to violate, or do everything you can to make sure that they're not going to violate in the future. So you have to work with the parameters of the state's law. In Nebraska, there's only a few crimes, alleged crimes, where bail can be completely denied. That's certain sex crimes and obviously murder. But other than that, you do have a right to bail.
And I have seen just, online, the question has come up multiple times of, does law enforcement typically monitor high risk offenders after they're released, or is that responsibility left to the victim to report those violations?
It's basically left to the court system and the victim to report the violations. The police cannot be there all the time. Most police departments do not have the manpower to monitor, to actually, have a stakeout on very violent offenders. We all wish that they did have those resources, but they don't. The police can only do certain things. They can make the arrest, they can investigate a crime, they could put the person in jail. But as soon as the person gets in jail and starts going through the system, well, then it falls on the prosecutors and the judges. Now, in this case, because Mr. Kindt had, a number of violations from what we know of his conditions of release, yes, the judge would have been in her full authority to revoke his previous bail and set greater conditions, higher bails, maybe a GPS monitoring system, something along those lines. So you could ensure that, perhaps he's not going to be released from jail, but if he is, he's going to have something where you could monitor him. And if someone in that position ever say, broke free of their monitor, cut it off, well, that would be a violation and you could go immediately arrest them.
Well, what legal consequences, if any, could judges or prosecutors face if it is determined that they failed to protect Jamie by allowing Mr. Kindt to be released despite the risks?
There are no legal consequences because this is all within the discretion of a judge. And judges should have discretion. I mean, the judge in this case, I'm sure, hindsight 2020 probably, would wish that she did set a higher bail or some other conditions or revoke the previous bail. But like I said, a judge, they're not clairvoyant. They can't, foretell the future. But the only consequence that the public has is you can vote the prosecutor out, you could vote the judge out. Nebraska has a system of what's called retention elections. That means, for the most part, a judge is appointed, and then they have to run for a retention election, meaning that the voters get to say, should we keep this judge? And I believe in Nebraska, it's every 6 years. So really, your only recourse as a public is a political recourse. You don't have to elect the same prosecutor, the DA's office. You don't have to elect the same judge.
And so now, the question on a lot of people's minds, what happens to the suspect now? There's no way he will be granted bail again, correct?
I doubt it, because with the murder charge, and again, there are certain crimes, and I don't know exactly what type of murder the prosecutors are going to be charging him with. But in Nebraska, as in many states, if you're charged with some very heinous, serious charges, well, then they could keep you in detention. And that's similar to the federal system. In our federal system, there are a number of different very serious charges where they could keep you in detention.
Given his background too, correct? Like, he did this while he was out on bond.
Well, that's correct. Every time someone, a defendant, goes in front of a judge to get conditions of release or bail set, their previous history of being out on bond, of being out on some conditional release is highly relevant. Why? Because, many times a leopard doesn't change its spots. So if you've got someone who repeatedly violates court orders, repeatedly misses court, you're going to think, well, probably in the future they're going to do the same.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This is definitely a case that we will be following closely. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Jamie did have a young daughter that is now left to grow up without her because of this tragedy. Here to discuss how domestic violence can affect children, I have Dr. April Alexander. Doctor, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just dive right in. Such a heartbreaking story. How does witnessing domestic violence, especially repeated incidents, affect a child's mental and emotional development?
Well, we know in a lot of these cases with domestic violence where children are involved, one, they might be repeatedly witnessing the violence. Thinking about what that might look like for a developing child, of thinking about the anger that they're exhibiting. Sometimes violent acts towards them or their pets has been frequent. And thinking about what that does in terms of the relationship that you have with your caregivers. So obviously, maybe in this case, some rupture that might be going on with the father. Distancing with the mom could be a potential effect on that. And that's going to have some long-term consequences on the child, whether that's how they're relating to other adults in their lives or just general relationships.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, what are the long-term psychological effects?
When we look at cases of trauma, we see both short-term and long-term effects. Some of those short-term effects could be the distancing, depression, anxiety, everything that you can think of when we're talking about exposure to trauma. In the long term, really thinking about for individuals ruptures in their relationships. Some of these children who experience witnessing domestic violence experience it later in life. So that kind of speaks to maybe some of that rupture in intimate partner relationships due to what they've witnessed.
Wow, can you go into more detail about that? So usually you're saying that children that may have witnessed either their parents or someone else important in their lives get abused, they may become abused later in life?
It has been a factor, obviously not in all cases, but in some cases we do see individuals who witness violence. Let's think about it of that being your norm. That being your norm of witnessing a caregiver show quote unquote love towards someone else through hitting, through abuse, through manipulation. And so, if that's all you know, that might make you susceptible to finding someone who is engaging in those same actions. So, I think that's often important for us to recognize when we know individuals who have these histories of victimization, of really reflecting on none of this is normal and should be accepted.
Now, according to court documents, the suspect allegedly assaulted Jamie, the victim, and threatened her and her daughter prior to her death. In cases where a child is also threatened, how does that impact their sense of safety and trust in adults?
Yeah, so we see in about 14% of these domestic violence related homicide, suicide attempt cases that a child is present. So we're talking that a child witnessed not only the longstanding abuse that could have occurred, but also the homicide. And again, just thinking about the rupture in relationships that sows. Jamie's child losing a caregiver, that we see that post-traumatic loss and post-traumatic grief can often affect the child again in the short term and long term in thinking about how they relate to others, how they manage. And I hope in this case, as with all cases, that there is some appropriate intervention, whether that's therapy or other resources in the child's life to help support and buffer those long-term consequences.
Yeah, and in this, specific instance, there's a chance that Jamie's daughter may have seen her, get killed. How does that just affect someone's, mental health, their psyche, to see their mother, who is probably the most important person in their life, get killed in that way?
I mean, obviously, it's tragic. And again, in cases like this, it's probably been ongoing abuse that's occurred. So for it to culminate in murder and I think a potential suicide attempt, just thinking about the immediate trauma that that has on that child, I can't even imagine what went on in the moments afterwards of the 911 call attempts, to helping possibly try to revive your mother. So really kind of thinking about the potentially traumatic event that occurred while witnessing this.
What are some common behavioral emotional changes seen in children who have been exposed to domestic violence?
It's a wide range. We can't always stereotype how a person might react, but we know what's often common. So, again, it could be depression, which could exhibit itself in withdrawal symptoms, sadness, even your own suicidal ideation as you're trying to process your grief and loss. For some children, they engage in externalizing behavior, so acting out in anger and aggression after they've experienced a traumatic event. Others dissociate. So pushing yourself and distancing away, especially if you did witness this horrific murder, being your own protective mechanisms trying to block that out for you.
I think we touched on this a little bit in the beginning, but what types of therapy or interventions are most effective for children dealing with trauma from domestic violence?
Yeah, I used to do a lot of work with children who had exposure to domestic violence, sexual assault, and other types of traumatic incidents. It's not one size fit all, but there are interventions that help, and that's the core message that I want to get out to people. One of the mechanisms that we've done is multisystemic family therapy. So, how do we involve caregivers who are still present in the treatment of this child and being able to support and care for them? There's also trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which also has a component of addressing traumatic grief in it. So, all of this is what you might normally see in your traditional psychotherapy, talk therapy, to address what you've witnessed, the impact, how you're feeling, and thinking about your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors and reactions, and really thinking about how do you cope with your present state.
And I know, my last question isn't necessarily under your wheelhouse, but I know you have studied a lot of cases like this. Do you believe the current legal system does enough to protect children from the effects of domestic violence? And, what improvements could possibly be made?
I think this is all a challenge. We have to recognize that 1 in 4 individuals has experienced domestic violence in their lifetime. We have one of these murder suicide attempts happening a day for a domestic violence related homicide, and 93% of them happen with guns. So we need to be thinking about ways that we can craft policy in order to mitigate the exposure of domestic violence in the house and for children to witness. We've been brainstorming ways to mitigate this in the past. So, in this particular case, there was a domestic violence order that has been one protective mechanism in order to keep people safe, particularly their children. In 22 states, we're also looking at extreme risk protection orders. So, for individuals who've had a pattern of domestic violence and are in imminent danger, removing guns away from the house. Again, that appeared to be done, but there are still loopholes. So we need to continue to think about how do we best intervene to protect not only the immediate victim, but the youth and others who experience this.
Great. Thank you so much, doctor, for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
Casey Kindt's injuries are not expected to be life-threatening. He has been arrested and charged with first-degree murder, use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony, possession of a firearm by a prohibited person, burglary, and child abuse. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.